After rescuing a lion cub, a man finds himself surrounded by the pride, and what happens next is nothing short of astonishing. The muddy waters of the Mara River thundered around Tom Smith's chest, each crashing surge threatening to pull him under as he pushed forward, inch by desperate inch. Clinging to his shoulders was a small, trembling lion cub, soaked, half-conscious, and barely holding on. The animal's claws dug into the fabric of Tom's shirt, but he barely felt them. The adrenaline, the cold, and the sheer force of the river drowned out everything except the singular focus of survival. Just moments earlier, Tom had been alone on the riverbank, preparing to capture what he thought would be a quiet morning in Kenya's Masai Mara. The 31-year-old wildlife photographer had spent over a decade in the field, earning a reputation for his discipline and deep respect for the laws of nature, especially the unspoken one followed by all professionals in his line of work: never interfere. But rules bend in the face of instinct. It happened in the blink of an eye, a flash of motion, a splash, then the heart-wrenching sound of a cub's cry as the young lion was swept off the crumbling riverbank by a current swollen from the previous night's torrential rain. The cub couldn't have been more than 3 months old, small, vulnerable, still learning the limits of its world. One misstep had sent it tumbling into chaos. Tom froze for a split second, his instincts at war with his training. But when the cub cried out again, its voice high, piercing, terrified, something inside him shattered. Without thinking, he dropped his camera, kicked off his boots, and leapt into the river. "I couldn't just stand there," he would later say in a trembling voice during an interview. "It wasn't a decision, it was a reaction. He was just a baby." But the Mara is no place for second chances. The river was ruthless, invisible hazards lurked below the surface. Tangled roots, jagged rocks, and treacherous undertows that had claimed the lives of countless animals and even experienced guides. As Tom pushed through the water, a submerged log slammed into his left shoulder with bone-jarring force, nearly taking him down. The pain was blinding. His vision swam. But then, he saw the cub. The little lion was barely above water, its head bobbing weakly, paws flailing. With one final burst of strength, Tom reached out and pulled the cub into his arms. The moment their bodies touched, something shifted. The cub clung to him with a grip that was more human than animal. Desperate, terrified, trusting, Tom could feel the rapid thud of the cub's heart hammering against his chest. It was so small, so fragile, and yet so alive. Every second became a battle. Man and cub against the river. The current fought him every step of the way, dragging them downstream toward a bend known for its crocodile-infested pools. His legs burned, his vision dimmed, but he refused to let go. Slowly, agonizingly, inched toward the shore, and that's when he realized they weren't alone. Unbeknownst to Tom, a silent audience had been watching from the edge of the tree line. Hidden among the tall grass and acacia shadows stood the cub's family, 5 lionesses and 1 massive male, their golden eyes locked onto the man in the water. The pride had been searching, tracking the scent of their missing cub, listening for his cries, and now they had arrived, just in time to see a human stranger emerge from the river with their child in his arms. Tom staggered through the final stretch of water, his limbs shaking, the cub still wrapped tightly around his neck. His boots found purchase in the soft mud of the bank, but before he could even catch his breath, he froze. They were there, 6 full-grown lions, staring, motionless, silent. Tom's mind raced. He had no escape route, no weapon, no plan. He was soaked, injured, and standing face to face with some of the world's most powerful predators while holding one of their own. Everything he knew about lion behavior screamed that this would end in tragedy. Lions are fiercely protective of their cubs. Trespassers, especially ones carrying a lion cub, were rarely given the benefit of the doubt. But the lions didn't attack. They didn't move. Instead, they watched. The air was thick with tension, every molecule electrified by the moment. Time stretched thin. The cub in Tom's arms whimpered softly, and the matriarch of the pride, an older lioness with battle-worn features and eyes that burned with intelligence, took a step forward. Tom's breath caught. his body tensed. This was it. But what happened next would defy everything science, instinct, and centuries of human understanding had ever predicted. What Tom didn't know, what he couldn't have known, as he dragged himself through the chest-high current, was that he wasn't alone. Hidden among the thick curtain of acacia trees that lined the riverbank, 6 pairs of amber eyes watched his every move. Silent, unblinking, calculating. 5 adult lionesses crouched low in the tall grass, their tawny bodies nearly invisible against the dappled shadows. They had heard the cries. They had followed the scent. The cubs' terrified calls had reached them like a beacon across the savannah, pulling them toward the river with growing urgency. The pride had been searching for hours, crisscrossing the landscape in widening circles, driven by a frantic instinct to reclaim their missing young. And now, just as the cub was on the brink of vanishing into the river's grip forever, they arrived in time to see something extraordinary. A man, a human, not harming their cub, not running away, but fighting, struggling against the very river that had threatened to take him. A stranger plunging into danger not for survival, not for gain, but to save the smallest, most vulnerable member of their family. And they watched. As Tom reached the shallows, each step became heavier than the last. The adrenaline that had fueled his desperate swim was fading, replaced by searing pain and bone-deep exhaustion. His left shoulder throbbed violently from the impact of the submerged log. The soaked lion cub clung to him with what little strength it had left, its small body shivering against his own. Every breath burned in his lungs. And then he looked up. His boot squelched into the muddy riverbank, his knees nearly giving out beneath him. Gasping, he raised his head, thinking only of reaching solid ground. But what he saw froze him in place. They were there, all of them. Not just the lionesses, but a towering male lion as well, his mane dark as dusk, eyes locked onto Tom with unreadable intensity. The pride stood in a wide arc at the water's edge, forming a living wall of muscle, instinct, and power. They did not move, they did not growl, they simply stared, their bodies motionless, yet filled with a barely contained energy. An ancient, wild tension that hung in the air like a held breath. Tom's heart pounded against his ribs. Every survival instinct screamed at him to back away slowly, to avoid sudden movements, to make himself small. But there was nowhere to go. The river was behind him, the pride was ahead, he was trapped, and he was holding one of their own. For a long moment, the world narrowed to a single heartbeat. The distant sounds of the Mara chirping insects, distant bird calls, the low hum of wind faded into silence. All that remained was the sound of rushing water and the wet, trembling weight of the cub in his arms. He had faced danger before, elephants in mush, cheetahs at full sprint, the unpredictable fury of the savannah in a storm, but nothing compared to this. Standing exposed before 6 wild lions, with no barrier, no vehicle, no weapon, only the cub, only the act of saving him. And then, the matriarch moved. The largest lioness stepped forward slowly, her massive paws making no sound as she descended the muddy slope toward the water. Tom's muscles locked, his breath hitched, he didn't dare move. Her amber gaze was fixed not on the cub, but on him. Every instinct in his body braced for the worst. But what came next would upend everything he thought he knew about predators, about the wild, and about the lines that separate us. The entire pride was there, not just the 5 lionesses who had been tracking the cub's cries, but also a colossal male lion, his mane dark as thunderclouds, standing like a statue at the center of the group. They formed a wide semicircle around the water's edge, a silent assembly of apex predators. Every one of them was still, their bodies rigid yet composed, their amber eyes fixed unflinchingly on the man standing waist-deep in the river with their cub in his arm. Tom could feel their gaze like weight pressing on his skin. It wasn't just watching, it was assessing, judging, calculating. His mind raced through every scenario he could imagine, but the conclusion was the same each time. He had no plan, no way out. No chance of outrunning them. He was trapped, chest deep in a dangerous river, injured and exhausted, clutching a lion cub with 6 full-grown lions between him and safety. He knew how fast lions could move. He had seen it. He had photographed it. A single leap, a single swipe, and it would be over. If they took him for a threat, he wouldn't even feel it. His legs trembled under the weight of that realization, though the river tried to hide it. Then one of the lionesses moved. She was the largest of the group, older, broader, her body marked with the faint scars of past hunts and battles. It was clear from the others' deference that she was the matriarch. Without sound or signal, she stepped forward, her massive paws landing silently on the muddy slope. The semicircle of lions didn't follow, they simply watched. Tom stopped breathing. His grip on the cub tightened instinctively. He didn't know if it would help or hurt. All he could think was, this is it. This is the end. Everything he knew about lions told him that this moment should spiral into chaos. He was a human, a stranger, an outsider. And he was holding a lion cub, her cub. Lions are not known for mercy. They are fiercely protective, territorial, and quick to aggression when their young are threatened. Tom had seen what a lioness could do to a rival predator that ventured too close to her den. And now here he was, exposed, vulnerable, carrying what any other wild animal would interpret as a stolen child. And yet, something was different. The matriarch stopped a few feet from the water's edge. Her body was relaxed, not loose, but not coiled to strike either. Her ears weren't pinned, her tail didn't twitch, and most notably, her eyes weren't filled with the rage or suspicion Tom had braced himself to face. Instead, they held something else entirely, something almost impossible. Recognition, and more than that, gratitude. It hit Tom like a gust of wind. In all his years photographing predators in the wild, cheetahs feeding, elephants mourning, gorillas protecting their young, he had never seen anything like it in a lion's gaze. There was an intelligence in her eyes, yes, but deeper than that, there was awareness. A look that said she understood not just who he was, but what he had done. The cub in Tom's arms shifted, then made a soft mewing sound, a fragile, high-pitched call. It was barely audible above the rushing of the river, but the effect was immediate. The matriarch raised her head slightly, ears tilting forward. The sound seemed to pierce the invisible barrier that had held the pride in solemn stillness. The other lionesses perked up. Their bodies remained motionless, but their expressions changed. Eyes widening, nostrils flaring as they picked up the scent, the sound, the truth. The cub was alive. The moment seemed to stretch forever. The air was thick with tension, yet something profound was shifting beneath the surface. Tom stood frozen, holding the fragile life he had risked his own to save, and stared into the eyes of the lioness, who, against all instincts and all odds, did not see him as a thief or threat. She saw him as a rescuer. And what happened next would not only rewrite the ending Tom had feared, it would challenge everything science believed it understood about lions and the emotional lives of wild animals. The sound shattered the silence like a key turning in a long-locked door. The soft, plaintive mew of the cub, a cry that barely rose above the steady rush of the river, broke through the electric stillness, and in that instant everything changed. The tension that had hung between Tom and the pride, so taut it was almost visible, seemed to fracture, releasing the moment from its frozen suspense. And unknown to Tom, every second of what happened next was being captured by his waterproof action camera, still recording from where it had been clipped to his vest, a silent witness to an encounter that would soon be studied, debated, and replayed around the world. The matriarch stirred. Without a sound, she stepped forward, her enormous frame gliding down the muddy incline and into the shallows. The water swirled gently around her legs as her massive paws sent delicate ripples across the surface. She advanced slowly, deliberately, her gaze never breaking from Tom's. Her movement was not aggressive, nor hesitant. It was purposeful, and oddly calm. Every muscle in Tom's body tightened. His breath caught in his throat, his legs trembled beneath the weight of fear and uncertainty. But he didn't move. His instincts screamed at him to retreat, to run, to do something. But some deeper intuition held him in place. This lioness was unlike any predator he had ever observed. Her eyes held no threat, no anger, only focus and something else. Something Tom could hardly believe he was seeing. She stopped, 2 feet away, close enough for Tom to hear the soft rustle of her fur as she breathed, close enough to feel the radiating heat from her body, the smell of damp earth and wild musk rising off her coat. Then she bowed. There was no mistaking the gesture. She slowly lowered her head, not in submission, but in a deliberate act of recognition. It was a gesture of profound meaning, an action that went against everything Tom had ever read in ethological journals, everything he'd ever witnessed from behind his lens. Lions did not bow, not to humans, not to anyone. For several long seconds she remained like that, her head dipped, her body perfectly still. Behind her, the rest of the pride did not move. They watched with unblinking intensity, as if they too understood that something far greater than instinct was unfolding in front of them. Something ancient, unspoken, and deeply significant. When the matriarch finally lifted her head, her eyes met Tom's again. This time, it was different. It wasn't the cold appraisal of a predator sizing up a threat. It was steady, intentional, and somehow understanding. In that moment, Tom felt something pass between them, not in words, but in something older than language. Not dominance, not fear, but acknowledgement. As if she were saying, "I see what you've done. I know who you are." The cub, still cradled in Tom's arms, stirred. Perhaps it sensed the presence of its pride. Perhaps it recognized the familiar scent of safety. It reached out with small, trembling paws, stretching toward the lioness, and released a series of soft, rhythmic chirps, vocalizations that only cubs use, almost like the cooing of an infant calling for its mother. The matriarch answered with a deep, throaty chuff. It was not a roar, not even a growl, just a low, rumbling exhale that carried with it comfort, reassurance, and familiarity. It was the sound lionesses make when grooming their cubs, when welcoming them, when telling them without words, "I'm here. You're safe now." The cub responded with a soft nuzzle into Tom's neck, then reached out again, its tiny claws brushing the air toward the lioness. Tom stood motionless, afraid that any sudden gesture might shatter the fragile trust being built in real time. But nothing shattered. Nothing broke. Instead, the space between man and beast, between species, was filled with something neither could fully define. Something that didn't belong to one world or the other, but to both. It was peace. It was trust. It was an unspoken agreement between a human who had acted on compassion and a wild creature who understood what had been risked for her young. And it was only the beginning. "It's okay, little one," Tom whispered, his voice raw and barely audible over the rush of the river. His arms tightened gently around the cub as he cradled it against his chest. "Your family is here." The words were meant more for himself than the animal, an anchor in a moment that felt too surreal to be real. And yet, as if the cub understood, or as if some invisible thread had connected them all in that instant, the matriarch took another step forward. The water lapped softly at her legs as she moved through the shallows. Her approach was unhurried, her body language devoid of threat. There was no crouch, no tension in her shoulders, no flash of fangs or warning growl. Instead, she walked with the calm, deliberate grace of a creature who had already made her decision. Her golden eyes remained locked on Tom, studying him, measuring him. Not as prey, but as something far more complicated. Tom's heart pounded so hard it felt like it might break through his chest. Every beat echoed in his ears, amplified by adrenaline and disbelief. And yet, amid the fear, there was a strange calm beginning to bloom within him, because somewhere in the lioness's steady gaze, he recognized something that didn't belong in the wild. A trust. What happened next would go on to astonish zoologists and ethologists around the globe. It would appear in documentaries, journals, and lecture halls, sparking debate and admiration in equal measure. But in that moment, there were no cameras, no crowds, no scholars. Only Tom, a drenched, shaking man standing in the shallows of a Kenyan river, and a lioness who had crossed a line as ancient as nature itself. She stopped within arm's reach. Her massive head lowered slightly, and Tom could feel the warmth of her breath on his skin, thick with the scent of the wild: grass, earth, blood, and sun. For several long moments, she did not move further. She simply observed him. Not in the way a predator watches its prey, but in the way a sentient being tries to understand something new. Her eyes, deep, amber, almost impossibly expressive, searched his face with a kind of emotional intelligence that made Tom's breath hitch. It wasn't just that she was aware of him, she was reading him, not just his presence, but his intent, his heart. She was deciding something. And then, without warning, she leaned closer. Tom didn't flinch. He didn't move. His muscles screamed at him to step back, to protect himself, but he ignored them. He understood in some primal way that any reaction could fracture the fragile bond that had formed between them. Her tongue was rough and hot against his skin as it made contact with his forehead. Once. It was a simple, instinctive gesture, but in the context of this moment, it shattered every known law of predator behavior. This was grooming, an act reserved for pride members, for cubs, for trusted family. And now, impossibly, it was being extended to him. She was accepting him. Temporarily, in some liminal, sacred way, this apex predator was bringing a human into her pride. Not with claws or dominance, but with care, with acknowledgement. With something that looked so much like affection, Tom felt a lump rise in his throat. He stood utterly still, every nerve electrified by awe. The cub pressed closer to him, letting out a soft chirp as its mother's scent drew nearer. The matriarch responded with another chuff, so low it rumbled through Tom's bones, and then nuzzled the cub's head before turning her gaze back to Tom. Gentler now, softer, almost maternal. In that fleeting moment, something ancient and unspoken passed between them. Not language, not instinct, something deeper. Something that said, "You saved him. I see you. I trust you." For Tom, who had spent a lifetime observing wild creatures from behind the safety of a lens, this was a breaking of the veil, a crossing into a world he had only ever glimpsed from the edges, and it had welcomed him, if only for a moment. He didn't breathe, he didn't blink, he simply received the moment, as though to move would be to wake from it. And for the first time in his life, surrounded by predators, soaked to the bone and emotionally undone, Tom felt completely, inexplicably safe. The grooming lasted no more than 20 seconds, but the weight of what had just occurred would ripple far beyond those fleeting moments. To the pride, the message had been unmistakable, delivered not in words but through the primal language of gesture, scent, and ancient instinct. Tom was not a threat. He was not prey. He was something else entirely. He was the human who had stepped into the wild's unforgiving heart and returned with one of their own cradled in his arm. And the lions understood. One by one, the other lionesses began to move, slowly, calmly, not with the rigid posture of alarm or suspicion, but with a measured grace that spoke of trust. Their bodies, powerful and sleek, moved without a sound, eyes trained not on Tom's throat or limbs, but on the cub he carried, and on him with what could only be described as acceptance. There was no tension in their strides, no aggression in their posture, only presence, only awe. Then the massive male stirred. Until that moment he had held back, a living monolith of power and vigilance. His mane, dark and thick, swayed slightly as he rose from where he'd been sitting watchfully. Every instinct in Tom's body screamed to remain still, but the lion's approach was deliberate and, astonishingly, gentle. He padded to the water's edge and then, in an act that would be documented and dissected by biologists for years to come, lowered himself into a relaxed, resting position, his golden eyes half-lidded, in what could only be interpreted as a sign of calm. It was the wild's version of a ceasefire, an unspoken agreement sealed in silence. Tom's breath trembled in his chest as he took his first step toward the shore. Every movement was slow, intentional. He was still carrying the cub, who now stirred gently against him, mewing softly with recognition. Tom glanced toward the lionesses, expecting resistance, a barrier, even hesitation. But something extraordinary happened. They parted. Like sentinels yielding to a royal procession, the lionesses stepped aside, forming a corridor in the grass between the river and the forest. Their bodies formed a pathway, not for attack, not for interrogation, but for safe passage. In that moment, they didn't resemble a pride encircling an intruder. They looked like an honor guard. Tom moved through them, each footstep squelching in the soaked earth. He was aware of every breath, every beat of his heart, every grain of mud pressed against his skin. Around him, lions stood watch, but not as predators, as witnesses. He had been tested by the wild, and somehow he had passed. As he reached the muddy riverbank, his knees buckled slightly beneath him, more from emotion than exhaustion. Slowly, reverently, he knelt. His arms trembled as he lowered the cub to the ground. The little lion gave a final chirp before unwrapping his paws from Tom's neck and tottering forward on unsteady legs. What followed was pure, unfiltered emotion. The matriarch surged forward, not with violence but with overwhelming urgency. She reached her cub in seconds and began nuzzling him furiously, her massive head sweeping over his tiny body, checking every inch with powerful, practiced care. Her vocalizations were low and rhythmic, a deep, rumbling purr of relief and reassurance that vibrated through the earth. The cub responded by pressing into her chest, letting out tiny, muffled mews as he buried his face in her fur. Then came the rest of the pride. One after another, the lionesses approached, forming a loose circle around the mother and her cub. Each took a turn, sniffing, examining, making low chuffing sounds that echoed softly across the open plain. They moved with reverence, as if part of some ancient ritual. There was no panic, no chaos, only awe. A quiet reunion painted in instinct and emotion, as if even the lions themselves knew that something sacred had transpired. Tom remained kneeling in the mud, chest heaving, eyes locked on the reunion he had risked his life to make possible. He was soaked to the bone, bloodied at the shoulder and utterly overwhelmed. And yet, for the first time since entering the water, he felt at peace. He had crossed a boundary few humans ever would, and the lions had welcomed him through it. The massive male lion, silent until now, finally moved. He approached with a quiet grace only a predator of his size and power could possess, his heavy paws making almost no sound against the damp earth. His mane, dark and thick like storm clouds at dusk, swayed gently with each step. As he drew near the cub, his immense head lowered. Not with the dominant posture of a king surveying his territory, but with something far more tender. He extended his muzzle and gently touched it to the cub's head. The contact was soft, measured, almost reverent. The cub responded with a quiet chirp, its small tail flicking as it leaned into the touch. This was not simply a check for injuries. It was recognition, reunion, reassurance from the leader of the pride that the young one had returned safely and all was right in their world again. Tom remained kneeling in the mud, motionless. Water streamed from his soaked clothes, forming tiny rivulets down his arms and dripping from his chin. His injured shoulder throbbed with dull pain, but he barely noticed. All of his attention, his entire being, was focused on the scene unfolding just a few feet away. He was surrounded by 6 of Africa's most formidable predators. He had no protection, no barrier, no guide. By all logic, he should have been terrified. And yet, he wasn't. Instead, Tom felt something entirely different. Not fear, not panic, but awe. Deep, soul-rooted awe. He was witnessing something few humans ever had, not a display of dominance or survival, but something startlingly tender. Intimacy within a wild lion pride. There was something sacred in the moment, something ancient and deeply emotional, and it left Tom humbled. Later, when wildlife biologist Dr. Sarah Mbeki reviewed the footage from Tom's action camera, footage that had been recording automatically throughout the entire ordeal, she was visibly shaken. Not by fear, but by the implications. The grooming behavior exhibited by the matriarch, she explained during a press briefing, is something we've only ever seen among Pride members. For a wild lioness to extend this to a human, it challenges our most basic assumptions. This wasn't just recognition of a gesture, this was gratitude, possibly even emotional reciprocity. It suggests a level of social intelligence in lions we've never scientifically confirmed. Tom had no such words for it at the time. He only had his instincts, and they told him he was witnessing something extraordinary. The pride had now gathered in a loose circle around the cub, their bodies relaxed, the tension that had once filled the air dissipating like mist in sunlight. They were lying down, grooming one another, rubbing heads in the age-old rituals of comfort and reconnection. The cub nestled against its mother, eyes beginning to close, its breathing soft and even. Tom knew this was his moment to leave. Not out of fear, but out of respect. He had done what he came to do. The cub was safe. The family was whole. Slowly, cautiously, Tom began to back away, his movements slow and respectful. His gaze lowered to avoid provoking any unintended response. He didn't want to disturb the delicate balance of this moment, the raw peace that had settled over the riverbank. But the lions had other plans. Just as Tom shifted his weight to turn, he heard a sound behind him. It wasn't a roar or a growl or any of the warning calls he had studied and memorized over the years. It was something different. Low, resonant, almost musical, a strange, rumbling vocalization that seemed directed only at him. He turned his head slightly. The matriarch was watching him again, her eyes steady and unreadable. She had made the sound. It echoed softly in the space between them, neither invitation nor warning, but something far more complex. It was, he would later describe, almost conversational, as if she were addressing him. And when she chuffed again, quieter this time, the other lionesses rose to their feet, one by one. They began to form two parallel lines, their bodies aligning as they had before when he first approached with the cub. It took Tom a few moments to realize what he was seeing. They were making a path, not just stepping aside, but arranging themselves with intention, creating a corridor through which he could walk, back to his camera, his gear, and his world. It was an escort, a silent, instinctual honor guard. Impossible, he thought. No scientist would believe this. No ranger had ever reported it, and yet, here it was. And as he stepped into the space they had opened for him, the lions did not move. They simply stood, present, watching, bearing witness. In all my 8 years of documenting African wildlife, through droughts and floods, migrations and hunts, it was never the roar of a lion that haunted me, not the growl of warning nor the thunder of hooves across the plains. No, what stayed with me forever was something softer, subtler, a low, rumbling call that didn't threaten. It spoke. It was almost conversational, as if some ancient dialect of emotion was being uttered just for me. That sound cut through the silence like a heartbeat echoing across species. It was the matriarch. She had lifted her head from her now reunited cub and made the sound with a deep exhale that vibrated through the earth beneath Tom's knees. It wasn't loud, but it carried weight, and the reaction was immediate. The entire pride stirred. With choreographed precision, as if responding to a cue in a sacred ritual, the other lions rose to their feet. Their movements were fluid, unhurried, yet brimming with purpose. Tom, still kneeling in the mud, blinked in disbelief as the lions began to arrange themselves into a formation. Two parallel rows, facing inward like a living corridor, their bodies aligned with uncanny symmetry, creating a straight, unmistakable path that led from where Tom knelt to the base of the acacia tree where his gear still sat untouched. The path made for him. It was not just a passage, it was an escort, an honor guard, a ceremonial procession not unlike those he had seen in human cultures, tribes welcoming a guest, warriors honoring a comrade. But this was no human ritual. This was something older, wilder, purer. "Impossible," Tom whispered, the word escaping in a breathless exhale. The waterproof microphone pinned to his jacket captured it, recording even the tremble in his voice. "They're seeing me safely out." And they were. The matriarch stepped forward, taking her place at his right side, her stride strong and steady. To his left came the massive male lion, moving with the silent power of a storm. Between them, Tom rose slowly to his feet, his every muscle aching, his clothes still dripping from the river, his heart pounding like a war drum. The 4 remaining lionesses closed in, 2 on each flank, maintaining perfect spacing, as if this formation was not spontaneous, but deliberate, ancient. And together they began to walk. The pride moved in unison, their heads held high, their eyes focused not on Tom, but on the land ahead, as though they were escorting someone of great importance through their territory. Tom, staggering slightly at first, found himself at the center of this living corridor of golden fur and muscle, his every step accompanied by the thunderous silence of a species that had chosen not to attack, but to acknowledge. It was breathtaking. Tom had spent years studying lions, learning their habits, decoding their signs, but nothing, no textbook, no fieldwork, no documentary, had prepared him for this. He was being guided away from danger not as an outsider, not even as a curiosity, but as a trusted guest. The Cubre's cat, rescued, revived, and now walking with a confident wobble, trotted beside its mother. Every so often, it would glance up at Tom with wide, unblinking eyes, not in fear, but in what looked like wonder. Curiosity, connection. It brushed against his leg once, lightly, before bouncing ahead, tail flicking like a tiny golden banner. Tom dared not speak again. The moment was too fragile, too sacred. Every footstep from man or lion was like a verse in a prayer he didn't know the words to, but could feel in his bones. The path led them past the place where Tom had left his camera gear, now partially caked in river mud and bathed in morning light. As they approached, the lions began to slow. One by one, they peeled off from the line, subtly, without fanfare, returning to the grass, the trees, the open space of their home. Only the matriarch remained. She paused at the edge of the clearing, turning to face Tom one last time. Their eyes met again, not with fear nor suspicion, but with something far more powerful: mutual recognition. Then, with a soft exhale, she chuffed, a sound Tom had come to understand as acceptance, perhaps even farewell, and turned back to her cub. And just like that, she was gone. Tom stood there in the stillness, surrounded by the scattered footprints of lions in the mud, the echo of their trust still thundering in his chest. He had entered the river as an outsider. He had walked out of it as something else entirely. Every few steps, the young lion would brush gently against Tom's leg, sometimes with its shoulder, sometimes just the tip of its tail, like a child needing the reassurance of a parent's presence. The gesture was subtle, almost playful, but it stopped Tom in his tracks each time. It wasn't fear, it wasn't instinct, it was recognition. A silent acknowledgement that this strange creature, this human, had been the one to pluck him from the jaws of death and carry him back to the living. Tom didn't speak. He couldn't. His throat was thick with emotion, his body aching with fatigue, his heart heavy with something that didn't yet have a name. He just walked, humbled and stunned, flanked by lions, following the invisible current of something ancient and sacred that seemed to guide the moment forward. As they reached the spot where Tom had abandoned his equipment, still resting in the tall grass near the base of the acacia tree, the pride came to a gradual, collective halt. It was as if an unspoken timer had expired, as though their responsibility toward him had ended where his began again. The matriarch stepped forward, slow and silent, one final time. Her massive paws barely made a sound on the earth as she approached. She stopped just inches from Tom, who stood motionless, barely breathing. Her golden eyes studied his face with the same intensity they had when he emerged from the river, but now they were softer, less guarded, more knowing. She tilted her head slightly, not in confusion or challenge, but with the inquisitive grace of a creature who had seen something worth remembering. And then, without fanfare, without fear, she leaned forward. Her forehead pressed gently against Tom's, her broad brow meeting his as she closed her eyes. The contact was warm, powerful, and impossibly tender. It was the same gesture lions use to greet one another after long separations, to reaffirm bonds, to say you belong. It lasted only a few seconds, but in that quiet, earth-shifting instant, the line between man and beast blurred completely. Millions would watch the footage later and weep. Scientists would pause their lectures to replay the moment. Wildlife forums would erupt with debates about cognition, emotion, and interspecies communication. But for Tom, in that sacred instant, none of that existed. It was just him and her, breathing the same breath, sharing the "Thank you," he whispered, voice hoarse, eyes glistening. "Thank you for trusting me." Whether she understood the words didn't matter. The intent, the feeling behind them, was unmistakable. The matriarch stepped back with slow elegance and released a soft, throaty chuff. It was not a warning, nor a dismissal. It was a sound of peace, of contentment, of farewell. And then something extraordinary happened. One by one, the other members of the pride followed her lead. Each lion approached Tom in turn, not with hesitation, but with calm certainty. One rubbed its cheek gently against his thigh. Another lowered its head and brushed its nose against the back of his hand. A third moved so close that Tom could feel its breath on his skin before it softly bumped its flank against his leg. These weren't random gestures. They were ritualistic, meaningful. Each one, in its own way, a tribute to what had been done, a thank you in the language of lions. Then came the male. The great beast, silent and still throughout most of the encounter, finally stepped forward. Towering and broad, with a mane that rippled in the breeze like a black flame, he paused in front of Tom. There was a heartbeat of silence, thick with tension. Then the lion extended his massive head and gently nudged Tom's shoulder with the side of his face. The force nearly knocked Tom off balance, not from aggression, but from the sheer weight of the animal's strength. It was a bump of acknowledgement, of solidarity, of grace. And then, as if a curtain had closed, they began to leave. The cub, Tom's cub, though he would never say so aloud, was the last to approach. The little lion sat directly in front of him, tilting its head in that slightly exaggerated way that young animals do, as if trying to read a human expression with ancient eyes. Then, almost shyly, the cub released a small mew. It was faint and high-pitched, but it cut straight through Tom's soul. It sounded like a thank you. Tom crouched, his knees sinking into the wet grass, and extended a hand. Gently, reverently, he ran his fingers across the cub's head one last time. The fur was soft, slightly damp, and pulsed with life. "Go on," he murmured. "You're safe now." The cub blinked slowly, then turned, scampering back to its pride, back to its mother, its world, its wild. And just like that, the lions faded into the golden light of the savannah. They moved as they had come, quiet, graceful, eternal, toward the shade of the distant acacia trees where they would rest, their mission complete. Tom remained standing by his equipment, soaked, bruised, humbled. The air was still. The only sound was the distant call of a bird overhead and the soft rush of the river behind him. His action camera had captured every moment. But there was no lens, no recording device, no scientific analysis that could ever fully explain what had happened here. Because what had happened wasn't just rare. It wasn't just wild. It was sacred. The footage would go on to become one of the most important pieces of wildlife documentation in the 23rd century. Verified by leading zoologists, dissected frame by animal behaviorists, and broadcast in documentaries across the globe, it became more than a viral sensation. It became a scientific landmark. Scholars debated it, biologists cited it, and wildlife filmmakers referenced it as proof of something long theorized but rarely, if ever, observed: that emotional depth and moral reasoning were not exclusive to humanity. Dr. Jane Goodall, the renowned primatologist and ethologist, reviewed the footage personally. In an interview that would later be quoted in academic journals and featured on international panels, she described it as one of the most extraordinary and moving demonstrations of interspecies communication and reciprocal trust ever recorded. According to her, it did not merely challenge traditional boundaries between species, it redefined them. And yet, for Tom Smith, standing alone by the river that day, drenched, trembling, and speechless, none of the global accolades or scientific analyses could truly capture the meaning of what had occurred. Because for Tom, the real impact wasn't something that could be charted on a graph or cataloged in a peer-reviewed study. It was something deeper, something personal. In that muddy river, surrounded by wild lions who should have viewed him as a trespasser or worse, a predator, he had experienced something transcendent. Not survival, not instinct, but understanding. He had felt seen, accepted, even thanked, and in that raw, wordless exchange, he had glimpsed a truth that science was only just beginning to catch up with. That recognition, empathy, and even gratitude were not traits confined to humanity. They were shared cross-species, expressions of something older and more profound. The cub he had rescued survived and thrived. Under the fierce protection of its pride, it grew into a strong, confident adult. In time, the distinctive mark on its right ear, nicked during its tumble into the river, became a kind of symbol, a quiet signature of the day everything changed. And Tom, despite the fame that followed, returned to his work in the Masai Mara with the same quiet dedication he had always carried. But something had shifted. In the months that followed, Tom would encounter the pride again and again, sometimes from a distance, sometimes up close, but never with fear. Every time, the matriarch would lift her head and release a soft, familiar chuff in his direction, a sound of recognition and peace. And each time, the lion he had saved, now grown and powerful, would approach his vehicle calmly, sometimes even lying in the shade it cast, resting beside him as if the memory of that river had never faded. Local Masai guides began calling him Ndugu Simba, Simba's brother. It was meant as a term of respect, but to Tom it felt more like a truth. He hadn't just photographed a lion cub, he had carried one, saved one, and in return had been accepted, even if only briefly, as one of their own. The story spread quickly beyond the savannah. Word of Tom's experience reached conservation groups, universities, and media outlets around the world. Tourism companies in Kenya began offering Tom Smith lion tours, hoping to replicate the magic of his encounter. But despite the best efforts of hopeful adventurers, nothing ever came close to that single, unrepeatable moment of trust and shared vulnerability. In response to growing international interest, Dr. Sarah Becky, the biologist who had first reviewed and authenticated Tom's footage, founded the Smith Mara Research Foundation, a pioneering initiative dedicated to studying cognitive empathy and emotional intelligence in wild predators. Her groundbreaking research drew from not only Tom's encounter but subsequent case studies exploring complex social behaviors in lions and other apex species. Tom's experience reveals a truth we've long suspected but have never fully documented, Dr. Becky wrote in her seminal paper, later published in Nature, that the boundaries between human and animal consciousness are not fixed walls but fluid membranes. What we witnessed was not simply a behavioral anomaly, it was a display of values, of gratitude, of social recognition, of honor. These are words we often reserve for ourselves, but the lions showed them first. For Tom Smith, who had set out that day with a simple goal to photograph a pride near the Mara River, the encounter would forever alter the course of his life. He had left his camp that morning expecting to capture beauty. Instead, he became part of it, not as a spectator behind a lens, but as a participant in a story far greater than himself. The experience taught him something that no camera ever could: that compassion is a universal language, one that transcends fur and skin, predator and prey, science and instinct. A language spoken not with words, but with presence, with risk, with trust. And for a brief, miraculous moment on the banks of the Mara River, it was a language that lions and a man spoke fluently.